There are places in the world where the air itself feels different. Where the weight of centuries presses down on every marble floor, every gilded frame, every carefully arranged vase of white roses. Buckingham Palace is one of those places. It does not welcome you. It tolerates you. And, even then, only if you belong. For most of the 20th century, the question of who belonged at Buckingham Palace was never really a question at all. Queen Elizabeth II decided. Her word was not policy. It was gravity. It pulled everything into orbit around her, and, what she did not draw close, simply drifted away into the cold. Camilla Parker Bowles had spent the better part of 3 decades drifting. She understood this, even if she never said it aloud. A woman in her position learns quickly that some truths are too sharp to hold openly in the hand. You tuck them somewhere private, somewhere quiet, and you get on with the business of living. That was what Camilla did. She got on with it. Through the scandal and the tabloid headlines that screamed from every newsstand in Britain, through the cooling stares of palace staff who had served the institution long enough to remember everything, through the years when her name alone was enough to make a room go still, she got on with it. But, getting on with something is not the same as being accepted by it. The distinction mattered enormously at the palace. There is an architecture to royal life that goes far deeper than the physical structure of the buildings, deeper than protocol or hierarchy or the elaborate choreography of public ceremony. It lives in the invisible things. In who is invited to stand where during a photograph. In whose name appears on which official document. In whether a member of staff meets your eyes when they speak to you or directs their gaze just slightly to the left, toward someone else, toward whoever it is they have decided truly matters. Camilla had learned to read those invisible things the way a sailor reads weather. Not with anxiety, not anymore, but with the cool, practiced attention of someone who has made peace with the ocean's indifference. She had not always been so calm about it. In the early years, the years immediately following the catastrophic public unraveling of Charles's marriage to Diana, Camilla had existed in a kind of social purgatory that had no polite name. She was not banished. Banishment would have been too dramatic, too official, too much of an acknowledgement that she mattered enough to banish. She was simply not included. Doors did not slam in her face. They simply failed to open. Invitations that would once have been automatic did not arrive. Events were planned around her absence rather than her presence. Queen Elizabeth had made her position clear without ever making it explicit. That was her particular genius, and it served her well across 7 decades of reign. She could communicate disapproval with the precision of a surgeon using instruments that left no visible mark. A certain coolness in correspondence. A certain rearranging of seating. A certain emphasis, in public statements about the family, on particular values and particular people, that conspicuously omitted others. Camilla was omitted for a long time. She bore it. What else could she do? She loved Charles. She had always loved Charles, in that complicated, inconvenient, terribly human way that refuses to resolve itself into something clean or simple or easy to explain to a tabloid journalist at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. The love had not been tidy. It had not arrived at a convenient moment or arranged itself considerately around the lives it disrupted. It had simply been there, persistent and stubborn and real, for longer than most marriages last. That love had cost them both things that cannot be fully accounted for in any public record. It had cost Diana something too, and Camilla was not the kind of woman who pretended otherwise. She carried that weight. She carried it quietly, but she carried it. What made the palace's coldness particularly difficult in those years was not the coldness itself. Camilla had grown up in circles where emotional restraint was not a personality trait but a fundamental operating system, where one did not discuss feelings so much as manage them, like a mild but persistent administrative problem. The coldness she understood. She had been marinated in it since childhood. What was harder was the uncertainty. Not knowing where the line was. Not knowing whether she would ever be permitted to cross it, or whether the line would simply keep moving, retreating ahead of her as she moved forward, a horizon that promised arrival and delivered only more distance. The palace has a way of doing that to people. Of making them chase a belonging that is never quite granted. Some people break against it. Some people reinvent themselves trying to fit a shape that was never designed with them in mind. Some people, the rarer ones, find a way to stop chasing altogether and simply stand in their own ground until the palace, in its slow, geological way, shifts to accommodate them. Camilla was one of the rare ones, though it took years to get there. The shift, when it began to come, was almost imperceptible. These things rarely announce themselves. A slightly warmer note in correspondence. A slightly less pointed exclusion from a family gathering. A mention in a context that previously would have been carefully, deliberately blank. None of it could be called an embrace. But, after so many years of ice, something slightly less than ice felt like almost spring. What the public rarely understood, watching from the outside, was how much of royal acceptance is transactional in nature. Not in a cynical sense, but in a deeply practical one. The institution of the monarchy runs on continuity, on the appearance of unity, on the projection of a family that, whatever its private turbulences, presents a coherent and stable face to the world. Camilla, whatever anyone thought of her past or her present, was married to the heir to the throne. Her position within the family was not a matter of sentiment. It was a matter of architecture. Queen Elizabeth, whatever her personal feelings, was above all a realist. She had sat on the throne through 15 prime ministers and more crises than most countries experience in a century. She understood that sentiment and institution are two entirely different things, and that the institution must be served even when sentiment points elsewhere. And so, slowly, incrementally, over years that accumulated quietly the way years tend to, Camilla was moved from outside the frame to inside it. Not warmly. Not effusively. In the manner of someone being granted a specific position at a table that had not previously had a chair for them, the chair appears, the space is made, and the expectation is that you will sit in it correctly and not cause further disruption. Camilla sat in it correctly. She understood the terms. She was not naive about what was being offered, and she was not naive about what was being withheld. What was being withheld, even as she settled more firmly into her role as Charles's wife and, eventually as a senior working royal, was a particular category of recognition. The kind that lives not in public statements or official titles but in private gesture. In the things that happen behind closed doors in a palace, in the rooms that tourists never see, in the decisions made about objects and inheritance and the quiet distribution of a dynasty's accumulated treasures. The jewels. There is no understating what the crown jewels and the personal royal jewel collection mean within the culture of the British monarchy. They are not simply valuable objects, though they are among the most valuable objects in the world. They are continuity made physical. They are history you can hold in your hand. They are the accumulation of centuries of monarchy, of empire, of alliances made through marriage and war and trade, encoded in rubies and sapphires and emeralds of improbable size. And, beyond the official crown jewels, which belong to the institution, there are the personal jewels, the pieces that have passed through the hands of queens and consorts and princesses across generations. These are the ones with the weight of story in them. This ring on this finger at this coronation. This brooch worn at this state funeral. This necklace gifted by this king to this queen who wore it when she met this president at this moment that changed this particular small corner of history. Queen Elizabeth's personal jewel collection was extraordinary even by royal standards. She had received pieces throughout her reign, inherited others, and worn them all with the particular elegance that comes not from the jewels themselves but from the knowledge of what they mean and the confidence to carry that meaning without being crushed by it. When she died, the question of what would happen to those jewels was not merely sentimental. It was dynastic. It was political in the quiet, interior way that palace decisions are always political, not the politics of parliament, but the politics of belonging, of recognition, of who is granted what kind of standing in the ongoing story of a family that is also an institution. Camilla was watching that question the way she had learned to watch all such questions, carefully, without appearing to watch at all. She had been watching it for years, in fact. The question of her relationship to the royal jewels was one that crystallized something larger and harder to name, her relationship to the institution itself, and the institution's relationship to her. Every piece of jewelry that Queen Elizabeth wore at a public event was a kind of statement. Every piece that a royal woman was photographed and told a story about where she stood, what she was trusted with, how she was seen. Diana had worn certain pieces. Catherine wore others. The circulation of these objects told a story about succession and favor that the palace never needed to narrate aloud, because the objects narrated it themselves. Camilla was aware that she had been kept at a certain distance from that narrative. Not excluded entirely, she wore royal jewels at state occasions, as was appropriate for her position. But there was a category of piece, the most historically significant, the most symbolically loaded, that had remained in a kind of suspended state. Not promised. Not denied. Simply unresolved, like a conversation that had been interrupted and never resumed. The Queen's personal jewel collection contained pieces that had been worn by almost every significant royal woman of the 20th century. To inherit or be gifted certain pieces from that collection was not merely a financial transaction. It was a statement of lineage, of trust, of inclusion in the innermost circle of a family that had, for a long time, kept Camilla outside it. She wanted access. Of course she did. Not because she was greedy, not in the way the tabloids would have liked to frame it. But because access to those pieces meant something that could not be separated from what they represented. It meant she had, finally, and fully, arrived. That the years of coldness and exclusion and purgatory had concluded, and that she was now, without caveat, without asterisk, without the invisible parentheses that had always seemed to hang around her name in palace documents, she was now, simply, family. The Queen, it was reported, had thoughts about this. The Queen, as in all things, had thoughts that she expressed through means other than direct statement. And those thoughts, it would emerge, were not entirely in Camilla's favor. Not because Elizabeth disliked Camilla in a personal, acrimonious sense. The dynamics of the palace were never that simple. But because Elizabeth had her own ideas about what certain pieces meant and where they should go. Because she had made her own calculations about continuity and symbolism and the stories that objects tell when they pass from one woman's hands to another's. Because she was, to the end, a woman who understood that in the world she had inhabited and shaped for 7 decades, the smallest gesture carried the weight of everything. The jewels were not a small gesture. They were never a small gesture. And the story of what happened when Camilla moved toward them, and what moved to stop her, is a story about what the palace is really made of. Not marble and gilt and centuries of accumulated grandeur. Something older than that. Something that does not yield easily. Something that had been watching Camilla for a very long time, and had not yet made up its mind. The morning light at Balmoral arrives differently than it does anywhere else in Britain. It comes in sideways and silver, filtered through air that smells of heather and cold water, and it has a quality of patience to it, as though it has traveled a very long way and is in no hurry now that it has arrived. The old stone of the castle absorbs it without warming, the way old stones absorb everything, witness and unmoved. Elizabeth had loved Balmoral above all her residences. It was the one place where the architecture of duty loosened slightly, where the woman inside the monarch could move more freely through the rooms. She had walked those hills since childhood, had known those trees, had brought her children and her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren to stand on those grounds and understand that before everything else, before the throne and the ceremony and the infinite weight of public expectation, there was this. Land. Air. The physical reality of existing in a body on the earth. She had made important decisions at Balmoral. Had received important news there. Had, in the end, received her last prime minister there, in a meeting that would be among the final official acts of a reign so long that it had come to feel like a permanent feature of the landscape rather than the tenure of a single, mortal woman. It was at Balmoral, too, that the question of the jewels had taken its most specific shape. In the months before her death, Elizabeth had been engaged in the slow, careful work that very old people who have lived very large lives must do, the work of deciding what goes where, of giving shape to aftermath, of ensuring that the things that mattered would continue to mean what they meant after she was no longer there to say what they meant. She had done this with the precision that had characterized everything she did. Lists. Decisions. Conversations held quietly with the people she trusted most, about the objects that carried the most history and the most freight. Some of those conversations, it would later emerge, touched directly on Camilla. And on what, exactly, Camilla should and should not be permitted to reach it. There is a particular kind of power that exists in the decision to withhold. Not to refuse. Outright refusal is too direct, too clean, too honest about where the lines are drawn. The power of withholding is subtler, more elastic, more difficult to argue against because it never quite announces itself as a position. It simply lingers there in the space between what was said and what was not said, between what was offered and what was kept back, and it does its work in that silence so effectively that the person on the receiving end often spends years trying to determine whether there was a withholding at all, or whether they simply imagined the whole thing. Queen Elizabeth II had elevated this art form to something approaching the sublime. The people who had worked most closely with her over the decades, the private secretaries, the ladies-in-waiting, the senior household staff who move through the palace with the quiet efficiency of people who understand that their role is to be useful without being noticed, these people understood that the Queen communicated through a system of signals so refined, so economical, so entirely stripped of surplus that learning to read them was itself a kind of apprenticeship. You did not learn it quickly. You learned it over years of close proximity, of paying attention to what was not said at least as carefully as what was. Camilla had been paying attention for years. She understood that her position in the family had been granted with certain conditions attached, even if those conditions had never been written down anywhere, never formalized into anything that could be pointed to or challenged. The conditions were understood. They lived in the atmosphere of the palace the way certain smells live in old stone. You don't see them, but they're always there, embedded in the material itself, released whenever the temperature changes. The condition most relevant to the question of the jewels was this: Camilla would be accepted, would be granted her title, would be permitted into the inner circle of family events and family photographs and family decisions, but she would not be permitted to displace. She could join the story. She could not rewrite it. The jewels were where that condition became most visible. There is a room at Buckingham Palace, several rooms, in fact, but one in particular that functions as a kind of inventory of the institution's material history. Not the Tower of London, where the official crown jewels are kept under the interested gaze of several million tourists per year, but a more private space, a working space, where the personal collection is maintained, catalogued, cared for by specialists who treat each piece with the seriousness due to objects that are also, in a very real sense, documents. Historical documents. Physical records of who wore what, when, and what it meant. The people who care for those pieces know their histories the way archivists know the contents of the documents they tend, not with possessiveness, but with the specific intimacy that comes from sustained proximity to things that matter. They know which brooch was worn at which coronation. They know which necklace was a wedding gift from which foreign royal and what the political relationship between the two countries was at the time. They know which ring was passed from which queen to which daughter on which specific occasion and why the choice of that object for that moment was not incidental but deliberate. They also knew, in the period following the Queen's death, that the question of what Camilla would access from that collection was not a simple question of inheritance or entitlement. It was a question that the Queen herself had weighed. A question she had weighed carefully, and about which she had communicated her preferences, not in a formal legal document that could be produced and cited, but in the way she communicated most of her most important preferences, through the people around her, through implication, through the strategic deployment of silence. The silence around certain pieces in the collection was specific. Pointed. Those who were listening could hear it. What those insiders reported, in the careful, oblique language that palace staff and royal observers tend to use when discussing anything that brushes against the most sensitive territories, was that the Queen had been clear that certain pieces were intended for specific purposes. That certain objects in the collection carried a symbolic weight that made them unsuitable for transfer to Camilla's possession, not because Camilla was unworthy in a personal sense, but because of what those pieces represented and where they had come from and whose hands they had passed through before they arrived at this moment. The most charged of these were pieces associated directly with Diana. Not everything associated with Diana, of course. The question was never so broad or so simple. The palace was not operating on sentiment alone. But there were specific pieces, a sapphire brooch here, a particular strand of pearls there, items that had been photographed on Diana at moments so iconic they had been burned into the public memory as permanently as any official portrait, that carried a weight of association so dense they could not simply be passed across the table at a family inheritance discussion without that weight being transferred along with them. The public memory of Diana is a complicated thing to navigate from inside the palace. She has been dead for more than a quarter century, but she has not faded. If anything, she has grown more vivid in absence, more ideal, more irreducibly herself, freed from the complicated human reality of being an actual living person and transmuted by grief and time and the projections of millions of people who never met her into something closer to symbol than to person. You cannot compete with a symbol. The palace understands this. The palace has always understood this. The question is not how to compete but how to navigate, how to acknowledge without being consumed, how to honor without being defined. Camilla's relationship to Diana's memory was the most exquisitely uncomfortable territory in the entire landscape of her life in the royal family. She had not caused Diana's death. She had, by the time of Diana's death, been separated from Charles for some years in the physical sense, though the emotional entanglement of their relationship was never so cleanly resolved as any timeline might suggest. She carried the weight of the marriage's failure, a weight shared by many parties but distributed with spectacular inequality by the tabloid press and the court of public opinion, which had settled early on a narrative and proved deeply resistant to complexity. She bore this without complaint, or at least without complaint that was visible to anyone who mattered. That, too, was a palace skill: bearing without complaining, absorbing without cracking, continuing without drawing attention to the effort the continuation required. But bearing something privately does not mean it disappears. It means it goes somewhere else in you, settles into a different layer, becomes part of the structure of how you move through the world. Camilla's relationship to Diana's legacy had settled into her that way. She was aware of it constantly without ever speaking of it. It informed the particular care with which she chose her public words, the particular restraint with which she engaged with questions that approached that territory, the particular attention she paid to how she was perceived alongside and against the memory of the woman who had occupied the same space before her. The jewels brought all of this into sharp, specific focus. Because the question of the jewels was not abstract. It was physical. It was tactile. It was the difference between holding something in your hands and not holding it. And several of the pieces in the collection that Camilla had, in the way of a woman who has been watching a situation for years, identified as significant. Several of those pieces had been connected to Diana in ways that the palace, in its infinite awareness of symbolism and optics, could not ignore. King Charles, for his part, was not oblivious to the complexity. He was many things: Charles, complicated, historically misunderstood in certain respects, carrying his own layers of grief and guilt and responsibility and longing that the public had never been given full access to, but he was not oblivious. He loved Camilla. He had always loved Camilla. And he wanted, in the way that partners want for each other, for her to have the recognition that her position warranted, for her to be seen and honored and given what she was due. He wanted her to have certain pieces from the collection. He had said as much. He had been clear about it, in the way that Charles is clear about things, with a certain emotional intensity, a certain conviction that what he felt was right, a certain tendency to push at the edges of what the institution would permit when his feelings about something were strong enough. The institution pushed back. Not through a single dramatic confrontation. Not through any one person planting themselves between Camilla and a jewelry case and delivering a speech about what was and wasn't permitted. That is not how the palace works. The palace works through process, through consultation, through the slow accumulation of small signals that, taken together, amount to a direction being indicated without anyone needing to point. What happened was a series of conversations. Some of them formal meetings of the relevant household staff, discussions among those whose job it was to manage the transition of the collection following the Queen's death, conversations that included lawyers and archivists and people with the title of keeper of various things that needed keeping. Some of them informal, the kind of conversations that happen in corridors and in small rooms and over the particular kind of tea that only gets made in certain parts of certain palaces, conversations that leave no record but shape everything. Those conversations reflected the Queen's known preferences. Her preferences about continuity. Her preferences about symbolism. Her preferences about which pieces of the collection carried a weight that made them unsuitable for certain kinds of transfer. Her preferences, ultimately, about what Camilla could appropriately be granted and where the appropriate limit lay. And then, there were the pieces associated with Diana. Those were handled with particular care, particular deliberateness. Some of them had already been distributed to William, to Catherine, to the grandchildren who were Diana's direct descendants and whose claim on her legacy was unambiguous. Those distributions were settled, clear, beyond discussion. But others remained in a kind of pending state, and the question of their eventual destination was a question that touched directly on Camilla. The answer, when it came, and it came not as an announcement but as a settling, a quiet closing of certain doors, was that several of those pieces would not be going to Camilla. Not now. Not in the immediate term. The reasoning was not stated directly, because stating things directly was not the palace's preferred mode of communication. But the reasoning was understood by everyone involved. It had to do with what those pieces meant. What they had always meant. Whose story they were embedded in, and whose story they were not. Camilla, when the settling happened, said nothing public. She did not react for the cameras, did not release a statement through a spokesperson, did not signal her feelings through the careful management of her expression at a public engagement. She was better at this than anyone outside the palace walls would ever fully appreciate. She had been practicing it for 30 years. What she thought, what she felt in the privacy of whatever room she was in when the full shape of what had been decided became clear to her, that is not recorded anywhere. It lives only in the space between what was said and what was not, in that particular medium of the palace that Camilla had learned to navigate, that she had spent her adult life learning to breathe in. She had arrived at a limit. A limit set not by a living hand but by the authority of the dead, which in a monarchy is often the most binding authority there is. The dead queen's preferences, transmitted through the institution she had served and shaped and sustained for 7 decades, had reached forward in time and held something back from the woman who now walked the same corridors. This was not entirely surprising to Camilla. She had known, at some level, that there were places in the palace she might never fully reach. Places where the stone was too old, the memory too deep, the imprint of previous occupants too indelible to be overwritten by the simple fact of her presence. She had known this the way you know something about the ocean when you stand at its edge, not by swimming in it, but by understanding its scale relative to your own. She had built a remarkable life within those limits. She had achieved an acceptance she had not been certain, in her darkest years, would ever come. She had earned a legitimacy that was now beyond serious dispute, had shown herself to be a working royal of considerable skill and genuine public warmth, had navigated her complicated situation with a grace that had quietly, incrementally shifted the way she was perceived by people who had once been certain they would never forgive her. All of that was real. All of that had happened. None of it was taken from her. But the jewels, certain jewels, the ones with the most loaded histories, those stayed beyond her reach. And the palace, which had witnessed everything and forgotten nothing, held them in place. There was another dimension to the story that existed almost entirely outside public view, which is to say that it existed in the only dimension that truly matters at the palace, the private one, the one that never appears in the official record, that lives in the understanding of people who were present and in the careful avoidance of people who were not. The dimension was this: Camilla had wanted to move closer to the jewels not only for what they represented in the abstract, but for a reason more specific and more personal than any symbol. She had wanted proximity because proximity was proof. After decades of existing in the uncertain middle space between acceptance and exclusion, she wanted the unmistakable evidence of full arrival. She wanted a piece of the collection in her hands not as decoration but as confirmation. The palace understood this. The palace always understands the emotional freight underneath the practical request. It has 700 years of practice reading the thing underneath the thing, the want beneath the stated want, the wound that animates the reaching. It understood. And it withheld anyway. Because the palace is not in the business of providing confirmation. The palace is in the business of continuity. And continuity, in this instance, required that certain things stay where they were, weighted down by the history in them, held in place by the gravity of a woman who was gone but whose preferences continued to operate in her absence the way the gravity of a massive object continues to operate after the object itself has moved on. The queen was gone. Her jewels remained. Her wishes, insofar as they had been communicated, remained. And those wishes had drawn a line that Camilla, for all her patience and her grace and her hard-won position, had not been permitted to cross. Not yet. Perhaps not ever, in the way she had wanted. It was a very palace kind of ending. Not dramatic. Not conclusive. Not the slamming door or the explicit rejection that would at least have given the situation a clean shape. Just the quiet persistence of a limit. Just the particular chill of old stone in new light, absorbing warmth without releasing it, the way old stones always do. Camilla stood at the edge of what was permitted and looked at what was not. She had stood at such edges before. She was practiced at it. She would not crumble against this one. But she felt it. She felt it in the particular way you feel the things that are almost yours but remain, for reasons that cannot be fully argued against, out of reach. She felt it the way you feel the end of a very long sentence that has been building for years and, then, simply stops, not at a period, not at any kind of punctuation that offers resolution, but, mid-thought, mid-breath, mid-reach, in the space where the answer should have been. Institutions do not grieve. This is one of the fundamental things that separates an institution from a person. A person who suffers a significant loss enters a period of disruption, of altered rhythm, interrupted routine, the world reorganizing itself around an absence that feels, at first, impossibly large. An institution absorbs a loss and continues. The gears shift. New arrangements come into effect. The work goes on. Buckingham Palace, in the weeks and months following Queen Elizabeth's death, functioned exactly as an institution. The grief was real among the staff who had served her for decades, among the family, among a public that had grown up with her face on their money and her image on their stamps, for whom the idea of a Britain without Elizabeth on the throne required a kind of cognitive restructuring that could not happen quickly or without cost. But the palace itself continued. The flags rose and fell. The correspondence went out over new letterheads. The portraits were reordered. The machinery of monarchy shifted into its new configuration with the efficiency of something that has been preparing for exactly this transition for its entire existence. Charles III became king. That was settled. That was clean. As such things go in a constitutional monarchy, there is no election, no interregnum of uncertainty, no period in which the identity of the next sovereign is in doubt. The moment Elizabeth died, Charles became king. The law made it so. The institution made it permanent. What was not immediately settled, what could not be settled by law or tradition or the automatic operation of succession, was the softer architecture of the new court. Who stood where in the new configuration? What role each person would play? What the new court's personality would be, its emphasis, its priorities, the image it would project to the world and the values it would project through that image. In that softer architecture, the question of Camilla was central. She was queen consort now. That title, which had once seemed unlikely to the point of impossible to many observers, was hers. She wore it with the ease of a woman who has waited long enough for something that by the time it arrives, the shock has had decades to wear off. She had been preparing for this role, in the quiet, private, non-publicized way that she prepared for everything, for longer than most people imagined. She had watched, she had learned, she had understood what the role required and what it did not, and she had made herself ready for it by the time it came to her. But title is one thing. Standing is another. Standing has to be constructed, demonstrated, confirmed through the accumulation of moments that, taken together, establish a person's position in the hierarchy beyond the mere fact of what they are called. Camilla understood this. She was engaged in the project of constructing that standing through her public engagements, through the causes she championed, through the careful, steady building of a public profile that was entirely her own, that could not be reduced to her relationship to anyone else or to the complicated history that preceded her arrival at this moment. She was becoming, in the public eye, not Charles's wife or Diana's replacement or the woman in the tabloid headlines, but Camilla. A person. A working royal with her own convictions and her own warmth and her own very particular way of engaging with the world. The public was warming to this. Slowly, fitfully, with the particular reluctance of a public that had formed its opinion many years ago and was being asked to hold it more loosely, but warming, nonetheless. The arc was visible, if not yet completed. Inside the palace, the arc was more complicated. Inside the palace, the question of what Camilla's standing meant in practical terms continued to produce friction in the places where practical decisions were being made. The question of the jewels was one such place. There were others. Questions about which residences she would use in what capacity. Questions about how her household would be organized. Questions about the relationship between her staff and Charles's staff and the protocols that governed how the new court's internal structure would work. Questions about precedence, about access, about the specific shape of what it meant to be queen consort in practice rather than merely in title. Many of these questions resolved themselves in the ordinary course of a new reign settling into place. Some resolved more smoothly than others. The jewel question was among the less smooth. There were people in the palace, not hostile people, not people motivated by personal animosity toward Camilla, but people doing their institutional jobs with institutional conscientiousness who held the view that certain pieces of the collection required a particular care in their disposition. That the decisions about those pieces should not be made hastily, under the pressure of a new reign establishing itself, but should be made with the full weight of their historical significance taken into account. That the history embedded in those objects demanded a deliberateness that could not be rushed by the expectations of any individual, however titled, however legitimately positioned. This was a defensible position. In many ways, it was even the correct position. The people advancing it were not wrong, exactly. They were right about the historical significance. They were right about the need for care. They were right that certain objects in the collection carried histories that could not be casually transferred. But they were also, and this is the thing that the more emotionally literate observers of the situation understood, advancing that correct position in service of something older and more personal than institutional conscientiousness. They were, perhaps without fully acknowledging it to themselves, protecting something. Holding something in place that they had always felt should stay in place. Honoring, in the way that institutions honor the preferences of the people who shaped them, the preferences of a woman who was gone but whose influence persisted in the atmosphere of every room and every royal residence in Britain. Elizabeth's preferences were not explicit law. They could not be enforced through any formal mechanism. But they didn't need to be. They were embedded in the people who had worked for her, who had absorbed her values and her priorities and her vision of what the monarchy was for and what it owed to its own history. Those people, carrying those preferences forward, were the living continuity of her reign. They did not need to cite her authority. They were her authority, extended into the present through the medium of their own professional judgment. And that judgment, when it came to the question of certain jewels and the woman reaching for them, was not favorable. Camilla's team, the people working on her behalf, navigating the internal politics of the palace's new configuration with the professionalism of people who have learned to function effectively in an environment where everything important happens beneath the surface, was not unaware of this resistance. They had been reading the signals for months. They understood what was in play and who was playing it and why. They were not naive about the territory. What they were navigating, in the long months of the new reign's establishment, was the question of how to move Camilla forward without triggering the specific kind of opposition that had historically been effective at stopping her. How to advance her standing in ways that accumulated gradually, that did not present a single large target for the resistance to organize against, that built stone by stone, gesture by gesture, precedent by small precedent toward the solidity of a position that would eventually be too established to challenge. This is patient work. It requires a particular temperament, an ability to take the long view even when the long view is very long indeed. Camilla had that temperament. She had been developing it her entire life. She was also, by this point in her story, something she had not always been in the darker years of her palace experience, visible. Genuinely, substantively visible in the public eye in a way that went beyond mere presence. She had built, through years of careful, unshowy public work, a recognition that was now substantial enough to function as its own form of armor. When the public knows who you are, when they have seen you at the cancer ward and the literacy program and the domestic violence shelter, when they have heard you speak with unpracticed warmth about the things you actually care about, when they have watched you do the work without complaint or performance, it becomes harder for the institution to treat you as if you do not fully exist. Visibility is power in a constitutional monarchy. Not the only power, and not the ultimate power, but real power, the kind that changes what is possible. Camilla had accumulated it. It was serving her now. The conversation about the jewels, about which pieces would go where, about what Camilla would and would not be permitted to access and where and, eventually, perhaps, to call her own, continued in the quiet spaces of the palace. It continued for a long time. It continued with the particular persistence of a conversation that has no clean resolution available to it, because the parties to the conversation are not simply individuals but are also, each of them, representatives of larger forces that do not resolve easily. There was the force of the new reign, pressing forward, asserting itself, establishing the conditions of its own legitimacy and character and continuity. There was the force of the old reign, persisting through the people and preferences and priorities that it had shaped over 7 decades, resistant not through any animosity toward what was new but through the simple weight of what had been. There was Diana, not present but enormously powerful in her absence, her legacy a kind of gravitational field that bent everything in the palace toward itself, that could not be ignored or overridden or argued away, that had to be navigated with extraordinary care by anyone who came into proximity with the objects and the moments and the memories most closely associated with her. And there was Camilla, at the center of all of it, patient, practiced, watching, waiting, reaching without appearing to reach, moving toward what she wanted with the particular discipline of a woman who has learned that the fastest way to what you want is not always a straight line. She had been stopped. She had been slowed. She had encountered limits set by hands that were no longer in the world and enforced by an institution that honors the preferences of its most powerful occupants long after those occupants are gone. She had not been destroyed by this. She was too formidable for that, and the story was too unfinished. What she had been given, in a way that was perhaps only legible in retrospect, was time. Time to continue building the visibility that was her most durable form of power. Time to allow the new reign to settle into its own character, to establish its own precedents, to develop its own momentum separate from the momentum of what had come before. Time for the resistance, not hostile, but real, to exhaust itself slightly against the simple persistence of her presence, her competence, her continuing, unstoppable being there. The palace has its rhythms. Those rhythms favor patience. They favor the person who can stay long enough to allow the institution's own logic to work in their direction. They do not reward urgency. They reward endurance. Camilla had endurance. She had been demonstrating it since before anyone in the current palace household had considered it a relevant quality. She had been playing the long game when the long game had seemed, to most observers, a game she had already lost. She had continued playing it through every reversal and every setback and every recalibration of expectation that the years had required of her. She was playing it still. The jewels sat in their cases in their climate-controlled rooms, tended by their archivists, surrounded by the weight of the histories embedded in them. They were beautiful and they were heavy and they were, each of them, a story frozen at the moment of its most significant telling, waiting for the next person with the right kind of standing to take them up and carry them forward. Who that person would be, in the fullness of time, who would ultimately inherit the most charged and most historically weighted pieces, whose hands would eventually close around them, whose neck or wrist or brow they would eventually rest against at some future state occasion, was not yet fully determined. History has a way of not being fully determined. That is one of the things that makes it history rather than mathematics. It contains human beings, which means it contains variables that refuse to be fixed, decisions that reverse themselves, relationships that warm and cool and warm again, power that shifts slowly and then, all at once. It contains women like Camilla, who are not finished yet, who have demonstrated repeatedly that the ending everyone assumed for their story was not, in fact, the ending. The palace stands. The jewels wait. The people within it navigate their positions with the instruments available to them: patience, visibility, endurance, the willingness to be present and continue and not be stopped by what does not yet yield. Camilla had been stopped before reaching certain things. She had also, in the long accounting of her life within these walls, reached things that most people had never expected her to reach at all. The story of what she would ultimately be permitted to hold, of which pieces of that extraordinary collection would eventually come to rest in her hands and tell the next chapter of their long, complicated histories, that story was not over. It was not close to over. It was simply in the part that looks like pause, like stillness, like nothing is happening. But, in a palace, nothing that looks like nothing is ever actually nothing. Everything is always happening. Slowly, quietly, beneath the surface of the formal and the visible, in the corridors where the real conversations occur and in the rooms where the real decisions settle. Everything is always happening, and the only question is whether you have been present long enough to understand what you are watching. Camilla had been present long enough. She would continue to be present. She would continue to watch. She would continue to move, in her patient and practiced way, toward the things that mattered to her, toward the confirmation she had been waiting for, toward the full arrival she had never stopped believing was possible even in the years when it had seemed most remote. The palace had tried to hold her at a distance. It had not, in the final accounting, been entirely successful. And the accounting was not final yet. The stone absorbs. The light comes sideways. The air holds its patience. And, somewhere in the quiet rooms of a very old building, a woman who has outlasted every prediction made about the limits of her story continues to write the next line, not loudly, not dramatically, not in the way the tabloids always imagined it would happen, but in the only way it ever actually happens inside these walls. Quietly. Persistently. Without announcing herself. The way she always has.